I also think that one of the main key pillars of any squad you've got, whether it's engineers, product, design, all the different components, there has to be one person in that group who is excellent at communication. And it's often the product manager. Occasionally it'll be somebody like a scrum master. In some scenarios, there might be a tech lead who is that communication person. But you need that person who is the communication Teflon that makes things just slide smoothly around, that makes information flow elegantly, clearly, and unambiguously around the business.
Today, I'm talking to Adam Horner. Adam is the CTO and co-founder of Signova Technology, which provides fractional CTO services and CTO coaching. Now, I met Adam last year through LinkedIn, and I was super impressed with his breadth of knowledge of product, all the way from, the business to design and engineering and much more. So, Adam, welcome, and it's great to speak with you.
Thanks for having me. It's my first podcast too, so it's been my New Year's resolution to do a bit more talking, speaking, and writing. We'll get onto the writing at some point, but great to be here. Thanks so much, James.
Awesome. Great to have you. Okay, so Adam, let's just start then with your background story and then all the way up to how you got to what you're doing today.
Sure. So I think I took a sort of a fairly traditional route to startup CTO, although maybe that's not so obvious. But I graduated last century from Imperial College in London, so that was a bit of a while ago now. And I went through then investment banking, consultancy with a wide range of customers. I had a bit of a tangent off into being a Kung Fu instructor for a while. But pretty much everything else I've done has been with software engineering, and teams. So after that, I was then in government work. I did a bit of military contracting. I joined the startup world by joining Palantir, which was just over 10 years ago now, where I was there for sort of 3.5 years through that sort of hypergrowth phase of the company. And I've been in startups ever since, really. So I went fractional just over a year ago, just after the change in the cost of money, or the end of ZIRP, the zero interest rate period. And that's how I get to present day.
And how are you finding fractional at the moment?
It's a very interesting space. There's there's a few who've gone before me who have done a lot of the educating the market around what fractional CTO means, how it works. And so I find that just in the year that I've been doing it, I've gone from having to explain to people what fractional CTO means, which is essentially a part-time CTO working for a number of hours or just 1 or 2 days in the week, through to being able to actually just sell my background, my experience, and the work that I've done with other startups and how it will compare to customers. So the perception of fractional CTO has changed quite a lot just in the year that I've been doing it, which is quite exciting.
I've seen the word fractional just kind of explode on LinkedIn in a way, and not just obviously in the CTO space, but in the marketing space and other sort of aspects of product and engineering. There's a lot of pressures at the moment, in terms of layoffs and, companies getting squeezed on how much they can spend. Do you feel that's affecting the fractional side of things, or is it actually the opposite? Is it benefiting fractional?
It's a bit of both. It's interesting. It's a bit of both. It's quite a choppy market at the moment. I think the fractional CTOs, some of the labeling is people relabeling themselves from being consultants or advisors, which is a certain number of people who've got more experience and more background in the space. But I do think there's more people coming into fractional CTO, fractional CPO, who have been working full-time previously. And as you say, they've probably been in a job where the company has had a lot of money and they've had fairly high growth rates. And now there's a lot more startups who are looking with very innovative ideas, and they're looking to be a lot more frugal with their money than previous generations of startups. And I think that's where a lot of the demand has come from. So yes, there's more supply, but there's also more demand. And as usual, there's a range of different companies looking for different experiences and levels of people. So that I think at the moment there is still more demand in the market than there is supply from people like me.
That's good to hear. Okay, so we talked a little bit over email about this elusive topic of MVPs. So I want to kind of shift over to talking about MVPs. And I'm hearing quite a lot at the moment. A lot of people claim that the idea of an MVP is a little bit dead, or it's evolved quite a long way beyond that original meaning. So what are you seeing out in the wild at the moment? And do you think that the framing of MVP still kind of works?
I think the concept is not dead. I think the term, though, is conflated with quite a lot of other things. And I think what's happening is that since books like The Lean Startup, Eric Ries, and others in the space have come out and the concepts have been understood now more than they were previously, people have begun to unpack what an MVP is and the stages that it goes through, that level of discovery all the way through to trying to find product market fit. So now there's a process and a range of terms that are much better understood. And so rather than just people calling that whole bucket MVP, there's labels across the different pieces of it. And that actually, I think, is the sort of moving forward, our understanding of what it is that we need to do to get to a point where we have a product that customers will pay for. So everything from the discovery phase, customer pain discovery phase, the minimum viable product, the minimum lovable product, the product market fit, which was Mark Andreessen's phrase that he put forward. And then that's been further expanded by people like Shreyas Doshi as well, who's got these 4 types of product market fit. So I don't think the concept is dead at all. Quite the opposite. I think it's flourishing. But I think the labels that people ascribe to it differ depending on people's familiarity with startups and launching new products into the marketplace.
Well, why do you think that, that slightly different labeling, MVP, MLP, why do you think that came about? And where are we now with that? How can we apply that to different types of companies that we work in?
And I think the different types of companies is the key point there, because I think the original idea of the MVP really came out of that software startup that was trying to build a new service for normally larger companies or for individuals, but normally sort of larger companies, medium-sized enterprise companies. And so now we've got people who are building MVPs that have come from spin-outs from other companies, that have come from consultancies where they're productizing or streamlining something they used to do manually, whether it's a service company, whether something that was done repeatedly by people is now being turned into a product and automation. There are hardware startups that are building MVPs where prototyping has been a long history of that in hardware startups, but now we're getting MVPs coming out of those. We've got hardware and software combined, so you'll have Internet of Things devices with apps that go with it. We have software startups, the traditional place where MVPs came from. And so I think that's where there's this difference in terms of how we approach what we do. There's a different cost to building something and putting together an MVP in hardware in terms of how easy it is to change, evolve, and move forward with the concepts than there is in software startups. And I think that's affecting how people think about an MVP and the different stages that it goes through and the different life cycles and the length of those life cycles.
Yeah. And that this mantra of, do things that don't scale, obviously you can apply that to, I can really see how that could work in a purely software space. For example, you could you could manually process, support requests in a way that you would traditionally automate that in a way to kind of get to market faster and just not have to build that automation or that software that you were planning on building. But does do things that don't scale work in a hardware world, for example? I mean, what might that look like? Or is hardware just very fixed? There is something that we do need to put together here.
Again, it does depend on the approach to building hardware. If you're going with small batches that you're building, testing, putting out into the wild, if you're selling large numbers of the hardware, you can afford to do small batches and test and iterate on those small batches before you get to the bigger ones. If you're building, a chip fabrication plant, as one of the biggest companies in Europe in technology does, those things take years to build and will be in operation for 30, 40 years, some of them. So it's much harder to iterate on something like that. So, those are sort of two ends of the sort of extreme spectrum that there are in approaches to building hardware. But in terms of doing things that don't scale, I think there's lots of different ways in which you can do things that don't scale that make that fit into the approach to it. Because I think there's a big difference between doing things that don't scale from a product perspective versus doing things that don't scale from a discovery perspective. And I think a lot of the times that I've seen non-scalable things that work incredibly well, it's when it's been used to understand the problem space, to understand the pain point that the customer has that needs solving. And so that approach to doing something manually, doing something with people in that process heavily, so you understand what the customer's problems are, where the customer's inefficiencies are, or pain points are, or extra costs are. Then you begin to build an understanding of how you can automate pieces of it. And then at some point, you have to step back and go, okay, how can we rethink this whole problem now that we understand it better? And so when you use non-scalable approaches and techniques to understand the problem space, I think that's probably the most effective way of doing things that don't scale. Otherwise, doing things in batches and small iterations can work. The challenge, of course, is that you end up finding local minima and thinking that you've found the optimal solution when you have found a part of a solution or one way of thinking about a solution in that particular space.
Sure. There's really a difference between doing things that don't scale at the discovery side of things and actually finding out the information you need before you write any code or you come up with any requirements that you need to build, versus doing things that don't scale at the actual implementation stage where you're cutting features, you're deciding not to build certain things because you feel like potentially a human could step in or there's something non-scalable that you could put in place. Is that kind of how you see it within those two different spaces?
Kind of, but I think there is a gap in the middle there because I do think sometimes you need to either get permission or get access to the real problem, the real challenge. One of the things that I learned at Palantir when we had forward deployed engineers who'd go into a customer along with the software to try and solve the customer's problem was that the first stage is gaining access. And often you'll need to solve an interim problem or an initial problem in order to get to the actual problem behind it. In some cases, that might look like our data collection is poor, our data categorization or storage is poor. And so therefore, even the customer, are unable to see what the real actual problem is because they need to solve a set of prerequisite steps first. And in building software solutions for classic customer problems, you will often have something similar. You need to build something that the early adopters will be able to start using so you can then begin to see the wood for the trees. You can see the problem now that you've solved some of the early pain points of where the inefficiencies are in a process that a customer doesn't understand needs wholly rethinking.
You're obviously fulfilling that CTO role, although because it's in the startup world, I assume that, you do have to wear different hats depending on the job at hand. Where do you see the kind of, let's say that, technical leadership as a whole, what part does technical leadership play in the building of an MVP or thinking about, this first release? Obviously, it's going to be very different across different businesses, but just give us a snapshot of what you feel are the really sort of important things for technical leadership to be sort of keeping an eye on.
I think the bit that I tried to boil it down to is trying to build fast without building into a corner. It's very easy to build things that create a dead end or a one path to the solution. I think building in a way where you realize that you're going to either throw some pieces away, re-engineer some entire pieces, or that you will need at some point to make an expensive change of technology. And I mean expensive from the point of view of time and effort, normally, rather than from the point of view of licensing or software or shared dollars. I think that's normally the thing where I think about how do we think about strategy in software development for a startup. Speed is probably the biggest currency, but speed allows you to run off in the wrong direction. And so therefore, understanding where the traps are, where the bottlenecks are, where the expected pitfalls will be, is often a key part of that. I think the other thing that's required as well, which is very easy in the early stages of startup when you can all sit across on the table from each other and talk, is you go through a growth point where you get to about 8 or 10 engineers. Sometimes it's 8 or 10 people overall, and you split into more than just one team sat around a table. At that point, communication is the bit that begins to become the hurdle. Recognizing that, knowing that, and making sure you put the correct communication mechanisms and processes in place. It feels costly at that stage because, hey, communication's been easy up until now, but it's probably one of the most crucial pieces to ensure that it gets right. And one of the most common breakdowns we see in startups is the conversation between the technical folks and the business folks. You end up with this sort of tension between technology and all the constraints and sales and what the customers need. And that has the risk to just drift further and further apart. Whereas if you can keep that communication tight, keep it close, keep close to the customers as engineers, as product people, then you can reduce the very real risk of ending up with that rift in the company. So I think those are probably the two big things that I think of as the startup CTO's early roles before you get into the full sort of CTO of, okay, now we need to think about strategy and all the other bits and pieces that go with that, leadership, recruiting, people, reputation, all the rest of it.
Yeah, sure. Those sort of, I guess, concentric circles of, business, product, engineering, it's like a constant battle to try and keep them like working together in some orderly fashion. It's obviously easier for a startup if they've only got 3-4 people around the table, but it is still a battle that it's still part of actually building something and working together, collaborating. And like you say, then you roll that out to teams of, product teams of, in the hundreds. You can see how that is a completely different problem to solve. So do you think that's why in the product space, especially, there just seems to be so many unknowns in terms of what roles, what roles people are? They can't, you ask someone to describe what a product manager's role is, for instance, and they're often one of the people that are involved in those concentric circles, along with someone like a CTO or technical leadership. They don't seem to be able to really describe their role in any sort of way that, is consistent with another company. So do you think that's why there is so much inconsistency between product roles in businesses, because that problem just inflates and just grows as the company scales?
To a degree. I also think that one of the main key pillars of any squad you've got of engineers, whether it's engineers, product design, all the different components that go into that, there has to be one person in that group who is excellent at communication. And it's often the product manager. Occasionally, it'll be somebody like a scrum master. In some scenarios, there might be a tech lead who is that communication person. But you need that person who is the communication Teflon that makes things just slide smoothly around, that makes information flow elegantly, clearly, and unambiguously around the business. And it involves everything from which direction are we going to what have we tried and what have we done, through to here's the status and the updates of where we're at. And I often think that if you can get that part culturally embedded in your early startup, then as you grow, that is something that will scale and provide value over and over and over. But it feels so expensive to get that right in the early days of a startup when you are only, 5 to 10 people. The difference is the payoff down the line. It's the difference between building a product and building a company. And I think that's one of the CTO's jobs to do, is to help build a company, not just build a product.
Absolutely. I love that communication Teflon analogy and that one person that's greasing the wheels and making sure that, everyone can be on the same page. And I've seen this in teams that I've worked in, that we often communicate over something like Slack, some sort of chat protocol. And I think the communication practices on something like that can be quite different to the communication practices when we're talking in person, either face to face, versus when we're talking on a video call, versus when we're talking via email. As a product leader, you're probably being asked to level up your product development lifecycle and give your teams some sort of a framework for delivery. You're constantly juggling the needs of your customers, the business, and your delivery teams. And any framework you do implement will need to align these conflicting needs and help you consistently plan and deliver your products to market. Let me introduce you to Avion. Avion arms product teams like yours with a reliable structure to build, launch, and iterate on products that are valuable to your customers. Instead of building based on technology or capability, Avion provides a clear focus on customer experience and outcomes. Give your teams the freedom to create and innovate while sticking to a consistent structure that can be scaled over and over again. You can plan strategically in the roadmap, tactically in the story map, and then mix and match. Avion integrates flawlessly with the best backlog tools like Jira, Azure DevOps, GitHub, and Linear. There will be no copy and paste and no stale data. Your planning and delivery will always be in sync. Does that sound interesting? If so, head to avion.io to see more. Or just send me a private message on LinkedIn with the word podcast if you want to chat. Now, back to the content.
I think there's one more that I'd add to your list there, and that's sort of the permanent communication through, for example, documentation, whether that's your wiki, whether that's formal documents about your product and requirements, and also onto things like what I call systemic communication, where you're using systems to communicate, whether that's your CRM, your sales platform, your development ticket platform like Jira or Shortcut or whatever you're using. And so I think when you've got a range of different ways of communicating around the business, people tend to gravitate to the one that they feel most familiar with. People who are structured and formal tend to go to the systemic communication. People who are quite verbal and good with words tend to go to one of the written mechanisms, whether it's documentation or email. And then there's a lot of people who've grown up with instant messaging as pretty much the only way that they've communicated between them and their friends through school, through university. And so therefore the Slack and communication there tends to be much shorter phrases, much shorter words, much shorter messages. And you can end up with a friction of just simple familiarity for people between those different mediums. Everybody uses them, everyone knows how to use them. You put your hand on the keyboard, you type. But the ways of using them, the kinds of phraseology you use, even the languages that people use in a multilingual company can end up being a barrier if you don't have approach to writing. And I think even for engineers who mostly write code, being able to write good common language, hopefully that's English in many, certainly of our audiences, companies, English would be the common language. But being able to write clearly is, I think, essential. I think it's one of those things that should be developed and built on as a cultural foundation. And there are some companies that are really good at this. Stripe, for example, is a company who have great documentation. And you can see it publicly when you just look at their APIs. It's very well written. The language is very clear. It's very unambiguous. It's written in a way that is sort of first class. And that goes to all of their communication, all of their marketing communication, their website, through to any emails and communications you receive from people who've worked there. And if you ever get the chance to employ somebody who has worked there, try and get all some of that knowledge out of them. There are other companies that do communication really well. A lot of remote companies have figured out that communication in the written form is essential to good communication. It helps with the asynchronous version of remote as well. So there's companies like GitHub, remote.com, and a bunch of others who have put forward a way of writing as a way of communicating. And I think it's essential. The sort of communication Teflon, as we called it earlier on, if you can get it to work at every single level of the business on every one of those mediums that you have and understand the importance of systemic communication along with the instant messaging and all the bits in between, I think it does make a big difference. Everything from talking with customers, finding out requirements, through to communicating new launches, new releases of your software as well.
Yeah. I think it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I was listening to a podcast with the founder of WordPress. So someone that's been in the technology game for a long, long time. And he talked about how as remote work had become more mainstay, he had to rethink his communication principles on platforms like Slack and actually come up with some, like you say, cultural kind of, I guess, rules for how you should be communicating within the business. And beyond that, I've also come across another company to add to your list there of companies that have good communication guidelines is Zapier. They've got a specific document about, how to communicate, within chat platforms. It goes much, much bigger than that. As you've mentioned, I love the idea of the public facing documentation, the API documentation, the emails, every touch point where you're not only talking to the public, but talking internally with the business. So yeah, super important stuff. And hopefully we've all got someone that's the communication Teflon. So I had another sort of thought. I was listening to a podcast. I think it was called VC20, and they talked about MVPs in light of AI. And they said, the concept of MVP has changed over the last, 5 to 10 years, where initially, when the internet was booming and SaaS products began to kind of, enter the market, the idea of an MVP and what users expected for an MVP were very different to what they are now, i.e. they expect a much more polished product now because you can build a SaaS product in a much shorter amount of time than you could, maybe 5 to 10 years ago. And they mentioned that AI is actually going through that same transition right now. And what customers expect from an AI-based product, a solely AI product, as opposed to kind of an add-on to something existing, there's much less polish expected. What are your thoughts on sort of where AI fits in the world of building MVPs and what we're seeing at the moment in terms of the just wave of products built on top of ChatGPT ultimately?
Well, I think AI in general, the large language models, the generative AI has had an immense impact. Everything from communication we were just talking about, where people can create, vast amounts of documentation far quicker than they could before. It's much easier to edit something that an AI has started for you than it is to write it from scratch oftentimes. I think it's everything from there to the MVP has changed. But in some ways, the MVP has changed significantly. And in some ways, it still has some of the same challenges and the same problems that still need to be overcome. I think one of the key parts about the MVP is understanding what the problem is and understanding the problem space. I think technically, there's quite a lot that's changed. Product-wise, from the product perspective and the problem understanding perspective, I think it's still a very similar game in that you build something that allows you to get access to the challenges and the problems. The difference is that now the bottleneck has moved from being the tech guys, how quickly can they build it, put code together, get a release ready and put it out there, to being the product folks. Because we can build and put together the MVPs, the technology part of it, the proof of concept, so much more quickly. And I think it's not just the LLMs and the code generation platforms and the AI code building pieces that have changed it. I think there is an element of that. But I think there's also one other key aspect which has come along at the same time, sort of quietly creeping in and kept somewhat under the radar, and that is the low code and no code approaches to software. Some of them augmented by AI for sure, but not all of them. And I think those have allowed people to build apps, products, prototypes very quickly, very effectively with data persistence that enables testing and exploration of a product space, of a product problem from a very, very fast delivery standpoint. And it's shifted the challenge from the engineers who are always slow, we're always late on releases, we're always trying to polish the last little bit, over to the product folks, because we can get those blocks of code out. We can get the working prototype out so much more quickly with so much more craft in it than we could, as you say, 5 to 10 years ago. That the pressure has moved on to the product folks. How quickly can you run sensible experiments? How quickly can you get the data that we need in order to make data validated decisions on what we do next? So yes, it's changed, but in some ways it's actually just shifted part of the challenge from what I've seen so far in the customer. I think the other thing is the verdict is still out on the quality of code that's produced and the amount of tech debt that's built up in the process of building MVPs. Because now we end up with a built-in obsolescence point where you need to graduate from your low-code, no-code solution to something that's more robust, more supportable, and more maintainable long-term. One of the challenges with the low-code, no-code environments is the maintainability of them. They are very quick to put the first bits and pieces together, but the more you want to customize, the more you want to get specific, the more you want to solve the actual granular challenges in your problem space, the less applicable they are to solve those problems, and the more you need a generic code base that's infinitely flexible to actually solve the challenges that you're trying to hypothesize about. And that's at that point you end up with a necessary technology shift. Now, we all know the dreaded rebuild, where a startup gets to a point where they think, oh no, I've got to throw my thing out the window and start again. Well, what the low-code, no-code environment, and to some degree for those platforms that are built initially on an AI-augmented code base, is exactly that point of we need to throw away what we've got, start again and build something new, or rebuild something that we've, one part of it that we've got, in order to generate the flexibility or the fundamental assumption that we need to break in order to move on from where we are. So I think, yes, it's changed, but not necessarily in the ways where it's quicker and different. I think the focus has just moved from engineering folks onto product folks, and then onto the business folks when it comes down to the decision to when to rebuild and how to rebuild. And I think, again, therefore, as a CTO, you need to start thinking about, I know I'm going to have this point. When do we want to do it? When is it correct business-wise? You're always guessing until you're in hindsight, right? But I think it's very much changed the landscape, but it's just shifted some of the goalposts rather than changing it fundamentally.
What are you seeing in your world where AI is actually being used effectively, and where do you think it's kind of still got its shortcomings?
I think effectively is probably the hardest part of that question to answer, because I think whenever you end up with a technology shift, you start doing the old things you used to do and putting it in a new way. So the analogy that I've seen used most effectively is putting on a stage show, but filming it with a camera and putting it on TV. And yet there's so much more that you can do with a TV than you could do with a stage show, all the digital effects and everything else. I think we're still with AI, still at that point where we are putting on stage shows on TV. So when it comes to who's doing things effectively, well, we can say who's doing it more effectively than other people, but I don't think we can set on an absolute scale yet. And I don't think that'll come out until roughly 10 years of working with AI. It's generally the sort of the time frame in which you begin to get to grips as a society with a new technology like generative AI when it comes along. So what am I seeing people doing then? I'm seeing people do some of the obvious things like automating chat lines and automating communication. Chatbots have been around for a while, and that was a really obvious approach to take to bring the LLMs to those. Some are doing it more effectively than others. There's some great startups doing it in the customer support space. There's others that are doing it with very effective approaches where they're taking in all the data from, for example, hardware support wikis or knowledge bases, product bases, and turning that into an interactive AI chat that can be incredibly effective to help a customer within just a couple of questions nail down exactly which thing they need to change or update on their hardware to make it work. I'm then seeing AI used to fulfill some complex file formats. When it comes down to it, a lot of enterprise software is fill out this file format. And there's lots of screens and forms. They change from being sort of 1980 style massive form that looks like a nuclear control center approach to more like wizard steps with a little thermometer bar takes you through it. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you're filling out a big data format in order to create something. And I'm seeing AIs used now to say, okay, now we've got thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of examples of these file formats filled out that have certain effects. And so putting that into a large language model and using chat to say, what are the kinds of things you want to achieve with the one that you're building now? What effects do you want to see as a result of this? What are the values and parameters that are really essential to you? Tell me what those are. And then the chat will generate a valid file format with all the checks and balances in there and then present that. And then you can go into your complex UI. And it's much easier to edit something that somebody's filled out for you than it is to start off and create from scratch and go through the 7 screens of the filling out the form. So I'm seeing that used, which is quite smart. I think there's also very similar to that, close to that, is building out data structures. If you're working with a data structure that's very formal, very rigid, and you want to get something that is close to that, like test data or validation data, you can use a chat interface, an LLM interface to help generate that. And then I'm seeing others that are doing variants on that. They go for an example where they'll say 2 questions to the AI, and then they'll generate 3 variants of the file format, the data format, and then use the LLM to go the other way around. So from that file format, describe what it is that it does with the settings and variables in there, and then use that to say, which of these 3 would you prefer? And then the customer can iterate on the one that's the closest to what they want. And so you can end up with a very interactive process whereby the customer still feels in control because they're getting the feedback on what it is they're building on this complex thing. But they are able to iterate down through different variants of what it is that they want to get there in a chat way, which feels a lot more intuitive, or can be done with a much simpler user interface that can be operated with just the voice, for example.
I think it's those types of products that they're clearly kind of using AI from the ground up rather than actually kind of just layering something on top of Chat GPT, for instance. I mean, there are some products where you type something in and you hit a sparkly button with AI. You can actually almost guess the response you're going to get back. Like, Chat GPT tends to say things like, you've just provided me with X, Y, and Z, this, and it almost tells you what you've done. So that's an interesting, slightly more enterprisey use case. And I think we're probably going to see more of those coming out. And it's probably going to be almost more in the background, and the user doesn't even know that the AI is powering a lot of their experience and how easy the experience is to them, which is a really cool direction to be taking. Interface design, experience design. It almost feels like it's going to be more so in the designer's hands as much as the engineering team's hands as well, which is cool.
I think there's been quite a lot of other interesting experimentation with, especially early in a product use journey, you end up with that sort of hurdle of how do I get from 0 to something? And that often involves either getting data, creating data, or understanding something as a user, understanding something about this product. And I think a lot of customers are beginning to use AI to shorten that time to first value, the time when you feel like, okay, this thing's worth my time now. And so I think there's quite a lot of experimentation going on in that space. So I totally agree with the user experience and customer value are two of the areas I think where certainly in the next year or so, we're going to see the most value generated out of the usage of LLMs and AI.
It's almost like startups could be leveraging AI to get to the aha moment quicker in an onboarding flow. And, that ultimately could lead to faster conversions, better conversions, more revenue. So it feels like an obvious place to explore if you can get the user there quicker. And then just my last question really specifically on AI is, how are you personally using AI in your workflows, or do you use it at all?
I do. I started using it with text generation. So I will quite often end up with a sort of a set of key points that I know I need to get across. So I'll write out the bullet points because it's pretty quick to write out the bullet points. And then I'll use ChatGPT to help convert that into something that's more consumable. So for me, it's about trying to make this communication smoother and make documents quicker and easier to digest and easier to use. And I think if you approach those kinds of areas, they're still sort of the fairly basic use cases of it, but they're almost becoming entry-level Office knowledge that you need. You need to use your Office suite, you need to use your spreadsheets. I think using AI to handle text is sort of essential knowledge right now, and I think something that'll be those folks who are in the workspace now, they'll have a slight advantage over folks who are leaving school, who haven't played with AI, who haven't had AI usage as a sort of a de facto part of their education. And there'll be a small gap there, I think, until people start using it more as they go through their education. So I think that's one of those areas where I'm making sure I keep my skills up to date with everybody else. I'm also using it when I'm coding as well, because yes, I do still get my hands on the code and still write code every now and again. So I'm working on a project right now where I'm using quite a lot of code generation in there to help me move forward. I'm also using it to help me when I go look up some other sections of code or snippets of code that I see elsewhere on the internet. If it's in one of the languages I'm not as familiar with, I'm learning a couple of new languages right now, I'll sometimes use the LLM to explain to me what the code does and how it works. And I find that allows me to accelerate my understanding much more than hunting around for documents on the internet. Because I think that I'll find something that solves my problem. I won't necessarily understand how or why. I'll then go through and use that basically as a teacher. And using AI as a teacher, as a mentor on going through a learning process is something that is actually accelerating me much more than I expected it to. So those are the two areas where I use it right now. I think there's going to be a lot of use cases coming up, though, especially around working with teams, working with communication within teams. I think there's quite a lot of new use cases that I'd like to test out. It's just finding the right opportunity, time, and problem to solve to use them and experiment with it.
I was doing a project maybe 6 months ago, and I was doing it over the weekend, basically. And I probably spent about a day's worth of time writing some code, in language I'm familiar with, in JavaScript. And it was like a scroll-based animation. You were scrolling, you were doing stuff, other stuff on the page was reacting to it. And at the end of doing all of that, and when I had a working solution, I kind of just remembered that, maybe I should have actually asked ChatGPT to see if it could do something similar. And I probably wrote a prompt that took me about maybe 4 or 5 minutes to write. And I told it which libraries to implement, what not to do, and what to make sure it took care of in terms of performance, which was all the considerations that I'd thought about when I was writing it. And it wrote the perfect implementation of it, obviously within the generation time it was almost one iteration. It was unbelievable. And I felt really stupid after that and just thought, what a learning, what a way to learn that there are some tasks, and not all tasks. It doesn't apply to everything, because I've also had bad results sometimes, but there are some tasks where you just need to ask yourself the question first, can I get something out of ChatGPT or a large language model first to get me started? If I can give it very, very strict requirements, it often will kick something out that will save you a lot of time. And if you already understand the mechanics of what you are going to write and how it's going to work, you can kind of be quite assured when you read through the code, because you're just sort of nodding and going, yes, that's great. I'm glad you thought about that. So yeah, it was just one lesson learned, very the hard way, I guess.
And I think it's one of those areas in which I think developers, software engineers are going to come back to being developer analysts, which is what was pretty much needed when I came out of university, that was when you need to have an understanding of what it is that you needed to do and the mechanics about how it needed to work. And the reason I say that is because I've basically got engineers in various companies I've worked with at different levels of seniority, from senior through to junior, to use the AIs, various of them, to assist their work. And the difference it makes to different levels of seniority is quite stark, not just simply from the point of view of how much does it accelerate you, but how does it accelerate you? And it makes a big difference on the juniors in terms of them understanding what works and what doesn't. But it makes the biggest difference to the seniors in terms of speed, because they can ask for the right things first time, like you just gave the example, which I think is a really good example. But they can also be a lot more discerning about, okay, this thing it's told me right now is rubbish. I don't want to use that because it's going to have these flaws and these pitfalls. And that comes from experience. So I think there's going to be this interesting acceleration aspect where it'll accelerate different levels and different people in different ways. And if you're working in a more obscure language where there's less examples, less background, less documentation, less written about that language, it's harder to move further faster. So one of the things that I think will happen as a result of this is that we'll have less new languages developed in terms of software engineering languages because it won't be necessary. It'll actually be more valuable to be working in a really common language, like, for example, JavaScript, than it will be to working in something more obscure like Scala or something else, Fortran maybe, that's been used a lot, but not recently. So I think it's going to come down to reduction. The actual value of the language that you're working will become a lot less important, and the value you can generate it and the speed at which you can generate value.
JavaScript just has so much vast sort of spread that there's going to be a lot more to draw from. And ultimately, I guess the developer in hand would be coding to a certain extent in the English language rather than coding specifically in a programming language, even though they need to be able to read the output code. Well, at the moment, they need to be able to read the output code. I mean, who knows? So I guess we could be interfacing with code purely through the English language or your native language at some point.
I wouldn't say purely, because I think debugging is going to continue to be in code. But just as we've seen us move up from the level of assembler through to procedural languages now into object-oriented languages, I think the LLMs is going to allow us to take one step further up that value, or the abstraction chain, I should say. So yes, a lot more interfacing in pure English language, or even in your native language, and then dropping to code level when you need to read, understand, debug, and otherwise, figure out what's going wrong in some code that has been put together, whether by you, with an LLM, or by somebody else.
I think let's call it here, Adam. It was great to talk to you. If anyone that's watching wants to hear more from you or get in touch or has, needs for a fractional CTO, wants to get advice from you, where is the best place to find you?
The best place to get me is on LinkedIn. Just search for Adam Horner, linkedin.com/in/Adam Horner. Best way to find me, message me on there. I'll get back to you as soon as I can.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Cheers, Adam. Speak to you next time.
Thanks so much, James. It's been great talking to you.